So thanks for coming along again. I might have scared off some people with some of the things I said 2 weeks ago. I'm glad some people turned up again, so that's good. As you know, I started off with a joke, so I've got a joke again today. So a guy came up to me last week and he goes to me, "Can you tell me what you call somebody that comes from Corsica?"
Corsica.
I go, "Corsican."
Well done.
All right, you've survived the bad jokes. So. Yeah. So this is the final talk of these 4 talks. So just going to sum up some of the stuff we talked about already, and then talk about the main errors that have been main errors that have flown through all the 3 talks previously, and then about the solutions to those errors as well. So that's why I call it staying on the straight and narrow path. So it's just trying to get back on to sort of thinking clearly, back sort of walking on the straight and narrow path. So here's what I talked about in the first few sessions. So I talked about biological psychology, talked about what I got right, I talked about psychology affects our biology, psychology is affected by our biology. So how our body affects our mind, pretty straightforward. Now the error was that there was an over focus on the body and on the physiology rather than focus on, they neglected the soul. They kind of explain away the soul a lot in biological psychology. And there was scant evidence for some of the speculative theories that are out there, particularly in psychiatry, when it came to sort of hypotheses about serotonin imbalances, dopamine imbalances. The evidence for this sort of stuff is not very good. So, and also I said one of the errors is avarice, just greed for money. Which has led to pharmaceutical companies making a huge amount of money. And then the results are just mass medication, emotional numbing, and humans treated like animals, as I spoke about in the first session. So, then talk about social and developmental psychology. So talk about circumstances of parenting affect psychology, pretty basic stuff as well. Just there was an over focus on social solutions, and it also meant it doesn't in terms of if you just sort out society, everything just works. It neglected sort of people's free will, and also who's defining this good behavior, bad behavior, and what a society should look like, and that leads to errors such as attempts at utopias, such as the communist revolution and things like that, and the disaster things that come along with that, and also dissidents can be treated or can be persecuted, and oftentimes children are seen as problem children are treated with medications that really does them a lot of damage. So then talk about in the third session, talk about cognitive and personality psychology. Talk about what they get right is the information we're exposed to is really important. So that really does affect our minds and affect our ability to cope in the world. What we remember is really important as well. Talk about the different types of personality, and talk about there's 4 or 5 different types of personality. That's sort of theory. That's pretty right. The error is who decides on what information people should be exposed to, and also there's some dubious personality models out there, particularly in modern psychology. So, and then the results of that are the mind is really confused if it's getting all this sort of nonsense and you're not getting the right information. And also morality is explained away a lot in the personality psychology, particularly. So that's just a brief overview of what we talked about. I know for some of you that weren't here, that's very quick, but that just explains some of what we talked about. So the root problems throughout all of the last 3 sessions, these have been the root problems. So the first one is the most important, is the biggest one, just that misunderstanding of what a human being is, and I'll talk about what that misunderstanding is. Then talk about the toxicity of error. So if error is introduced to your mind, that does sort of affect your will. So that's really important as well, that you be very mindful of error and falsehoods and lies and things like that. And also talk about the need for an authority. Every time we talked about this in the last few sessions, we talked about who's defining good and bad, who's defining right and wrong. So there has to be some authority there. So that's what I'll talk about as well. So where has modern psychology gone wrong? It's been going wrong sort of pretty badly over the last 100 years, especially. It's been going off on sort of really erroneous theories about man. But this is where psychology started out from. It started out the psychology in terms that phrase psychology, it became probably known around the 1650s, and it was referring to study of the soul, and it comes from the modern Latin psychologia, as it was probably coined in Germany, and it was from the Latinized form of the Greek psyche, which means soul, and logia, which means study of. So that's what it was. It was study of the soul from the 17th century. That's what it was focused on. Now that's changed. It changed over time, the meaning, and the study of the mind was first recorded around 1748. So about 100 years later, they started moving, shifting away from the soul a bit, sort of saying, folk were studying the mind. By the time it got to the 1890s, they started focusing on behavior. It wasn't so much focused on the soul. You can see the shift is it was going from the soul to the mind behavior. So it's getting more and more away from the spiritual aspect of it. And that's what psychology is today. And today in the USA, only 39% of US professors of psychology even believe in God. So you've got 61% of top psychologists, top research psychologists in the USA don't believe in God. They're atheists. And they're very important. The American Psychological Association is a very powerful institute, and it influences a lot of the psychological work around the world. So that's where psychology's kind of gone from. It started out, you could say it started out pretty well. It was, kind of study the soul. But then it's been drifting away from that for a long time now. So it's going the wrong way. So this is where you end up. In the first session, I gave a definition of what biological psychology was focusing on, and one thing it said it was studying was the emergent properties of the brain, which was talking about consciousness. So it was talking about how that indicates that consciousness or our sense of self is seen as a biological thing. It's seen as just something that comes out of our matter in the brain. But that's where our consciousness and that's where our sense of self comes from. So it's all biological. And the soul is explained away. So that's where you can end up, and that's where psychology is. And unfortunately, modern psychology, that's where it's kind of ended up today. Not absolutely every psychologist believes this, but that's the majority of psychologists, and especially ones at the top of the associations, are explaining away the soul. So I've got a picture here. It's strange. I've got a few pictures of cows up there. It'll make sense in a minute, all right? And I've got a picture of G.K. Chesterton, this guy here. Absolutely incredible mind. If anybody hasn't read G.K. Chesterton, he's well worth checking out. Absolutely fantastic man. Hard to read. Some of his books are quite difficult, but he's a fantastic writer. So he talks about how man is an exception, whatever else he is. If he is not the image of God, then he is a disease of the dust. If it is not true that the divine being fell, then we can only say that one of the animals went entirely off its head. So he's just saying that we're very distinct from animals. Like there is things we share with animals, of course. Animals have instincts like we have. They can memory like we have. But animals can't do things like reminisce. They can't do things like contemplate. This is things that only us humans can do. Animals we do have share quite a few things with animals, but we're very distinct from animals. And then Chesterton also wrote, wherever there is animal worship, there is human sacrifice. That's what we're going to talk about is, see, I worked in the psychological department in New Zealand for a while. I did a small bit of research there. And I remember going along to it was a kind of introductory lecture from somebody who's appointed the head of a psychological division in the university. And he was talking about how he was trying to show us how similar we are to animals. That's what the purpose of his talk was. And what he did in his talk was he had a big screen and he kind of put up Kim Kardashian as the sort of model of human beings, all right? And then he showed all these great examples of all these like birds that could do amazing things, and rats that could do amazing things, and dolphins that could do amazing things. And then compared it like Kim Kardashian. And then you can think, oh, all right. It's trying to say like how similar we are, because if you use an example like that, or if you look at something like Big Brother, that series, you see how bad the behavior is in these sort of shows, and you compare that sort of behavior, which is kind of animal-like in some regards, the stuff you see in our world today, and then compare that to the sort of skills that animals show. You can sort of say, oh, maybe human and animals aren't that different after all. So the reason I put up cows is because if you did that, if I was to try to show how different we are compared to animals, I might use a cow, and then I might talk about somebody like Beethoven, or I might talk about like somebody like Shakespeare, or I might talk about somebody like Aristotle, or Michelangelo. You know, you might talk about different, and then if you compare those, you can see how distinct they are. So you have to, in psychology, they sometimes, they're desperate to push that we're so close to the animals that they'll use these sort of examples. So just have to be careful with those sort of things. So cows and Michelangelo, there's a bit of a distinction there, right? Okay, so I've got a bit of a long quote here, but it kind of captures a lot of what I've talked about already. Can everybody read that, by the way? Sorry. But I'll read it out anyway. So this is from Father M.C. Darcy. He was writing in the 1930s. He was master of Campion Hall in Oxford University. That's Campion Hall is named after Campion, Saint Campion, who was a martyr during the time. Edward Campion. Edmund Campion, yeah, during the time of Henry VIII. So he talked about how the professional thinker is strangely tolerant of all sorts of views, which to some of us seem exasperatingly nonsensical, such as that all thought is a kind of physical behavior, which I talked about before. It's quite popular in psychology. That there is no difference between dreaming and awakening, that the room I am sitting in is as much part of me as my body. And then he talked about while he is prepared to take seriously the proposition that he is no more than the table he is looking at, he is unduly annoyed if it be suggested that the word soul is in place in a discussion on psychology, that the science of ethics has a number of loose ends unless some kind of immorality be admitted, that a serious philosophy cannot avoid the conception of a divine being. He seems to feel that the game is not being played fair, that he's being forced to present in some seance. So he captures, remember this is in the 1930s, he's not talking about modern psychology here, he's talking about his sort of academic peers here, and how sort of they just accepted all this nonsensical theories about the world and about man. But if you mention the soul, even in the 1930s, in England, one of the most, in an incredible academic, well, once it used to be the most incredible academic institution, Oxford University. If you mention soul, they almost like dismiss it straight away. So that's where it was in 1930. It got worse since then. It's 80 years on. Ireland held out a lot longer than England, I suppose. We still had common sense, and we were still grounded in the faith. So we held out a bit longer, but a lot of the psychological departments there are unfortunately like this. I've got a few quotes. There's a few quotes I don't want to, because this isn't about what I think. It's about what some of these great minds have already said about these things. So I'll use a good few quotes in this. So this is about, once you recognize that you have a soul, then this is the sort of implications of having a soul. It is that the soul means more than the body. Anyone who has followed the line of reasoning which leads to this conclusion will have little difficulty in appreciating from a merely philosophical point of view the force of our Lord's words. What exchange shall a man give for his soul? He will realize that it's the height of folly to think more of the body than of the soul. The soul is the dominant partner. It is the source of life and the directing and efficient principle of all activities. The significance of this was so well realized by Plato 4 centuries before Christ that he wrote in the dialogue Phaedo, when a soul and a body are together, nature enjoins the latter to be subservient and obey, the former to rule and exercise dominion. So it's not a Christian belief. It's Plato was 4 centuries before Christ. You can reason these things out. It's a very rational belief to say a man has a body and a soul. That's just rational. It's just using reason. So it doesn't take faith to believe that. And also the consequences, like once you start drifting away from, understanding what human beings are, consequences are absolutely disastrous. And this is a serious consequence. This is one of the principal errors. So it leads to all sorts of problems once you get the fundamentals wrong. So as Carl Robinson says, this book as well, by My Life with Thomas Aquinas, is an excellent book for anybody that wants to check it out. So she says, while we are seeing today with awe and astonishment the collapse of modern society, both East and West, the social order has to be built on truth. It can survive a lot of moral evils in its members, but not a basic error in its construction. Though this may be small in the beginning, it will have catastrophic terminal effects. This is what I think we are witnessing, the catastrophic terminal effects of error. It is though a fault line of misconception has grown and spread its influence to enlist the help of everyone, good or bad, comprehending or not, in hurtling to its own destruction. So she's pointing out how bad things are at the moment. Like, there's a high degree of like suicide rate at the moment. It's desperate. The homelessness rate, the mental health problems today are absolutely atrocious. Like, so things are falling apart, and Carol Robinson here is trying to point out the solutions. Once you get the fundamentals wrong, everything falls apart around it. Now, this is a quote. This is a quote. I helped my sister with some. I was helping her with her teaching course down in Limerick last year, and she was looking at sort of cultural diversity in education and things like this. All right. So there was a study done with different teachers and principals in schools, talking about education and cultural diversity. And this is one of the quotes that I just happened to come across, and I remember just storing it and just so because it's particularly bad. When people don't, when the truth is distorted, and people don't understand the soul, and don't understand that it's not just this life. Truth becomes less important. So people, there's a kind of indifferentism creeps in. It's not really that, truth's not so important anymore if there's not that much to play for, I suppose you put it like that. So this quote relates to the Quran. Now it could relate to pretty much anything, anything that's kind of anything that's kind of has errors in it. Okay, and this is the most important part about it. I think you can all read that. So the teacher says this is the principal of a Catholic school. Remember, Catholic primary school. He says, I wouldn't have a clue what is in it when it's saying this to the child, but we would tell them that it's beautiful and that they are working so hard. So it just shows that indifferentism. They don't really care what it seems like the children are reading or looking at, and just tell them it's beautiful rather than say, well, maybe there's something. Maybe I should check this out. Maybe there's something in it that they shouldn't be reading. So and that's really dangerous, that indifferentism towards the truth, because you hope when you send your children to school that the teachers are protecting them and making sure that they're guiding them the right way. So you wouldn't want to see that. You wouldn't want to say, well, I don't really know what they're reading, but it's beautiful. So, and that's one of the errors that creeps in. So once you kind of detach from the understanding of human beings, then all sorts of crazy, confusing, and elaborate theories come in to sort of fill their place. And this is the sort of stuff that you're seeing over the last 100 years, particularly. I'll just read out another quote here. There's a quote from Father Doolin, a book called The Philosophy for the Layman. It's another really good book. It's from around the 1930s, I think, as well. A lot of these books are old because they're just classics. I mean, and they've got the imprimadors as well. People might have heard of the imprimadors, which is your approval that there's no theological errors in any of these books. So he talks about how sort of elaborate theories come about. He talks about I find the soul so hard to understand, sighed Professor Edgar Brightman at Boston University in 1926. That accounts perhaps for the amount of nonsense that we find in modern writing on the subject of the soul. Men are not slow nowadays to write about what they do not understand. They seem to assume that if the Middle Ages were ages of faith, this modern one is one of credulity. They certainly didn't make demands on the credulity of their readers that no medieval would have dared to make. The men of the Middle Ages would have simply laughed at them. So it's kind of like these theories that have been coming up with over the last 100 years or so. They're just nonsense, really, because they don't have the firm basis that they need. So also with this sort of lack of understanding of man and of human beings, there's also the decreased morality. We can see this in our own eyes. Like we see this around Longford. I know people. I know a lady that's in her 80s that would be Longford was a great town years ago, but she's scared to wander around Longford town anymore. Like, you know, we see this with our own eyes. And we also see increased anxiety, mental health issues. As I've spoken about before, psychotherapists have never been busier, pharmaceutical companies have never been richer, and there's loads of people on medication as well. Now, there is a pushback against this, and that's right and just. There's a conservative reaction to say, look, we need to re-establish order. Things are getting crazy in our society, so we need to have some order. But it won't achieve anything without foundation in the truth. So even if there is sort of a conservative reaction, it won't achieve anything without getting back to basics, without understanding what exactly human beings are. You see that in the likes of Bolivia, or not Bolivia, in the Philippines, where you've got Duterte, the president, I think it's Duterte, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he's put to death drug dealers and people, drug addicts. And some people say that's a good reaction. Some people they think that's, you know, a good kind of re-establishing order. So there's something all right in it, in terms of, like, you know, at least he's trying to re-establish order. But if you really want to go after the criminals, you want to go after some of the pharmaceutical executives as well. So you want to go after them. They're the ones that are pushing a lot of their products are then leading to mass medication or mass medication and addiction. So just have to be careful with that. So what do you do? Like, you know, the world's crazy. So what do you do about the sort of current situation that we find ourselves in? And one of the things there's two books that I recommended in the earlier talks. One is 1984. People might have read. It's pretty famous. 1984. It's George Orwell, which talks about sort of the oppressive communist system, really. And at the end of that, the person at the end of that is kind of broken. The system breaks him pretty much. He kind of you can tell at the end he's just got with the program, kind of. You know, that's kind of what's happened. Now in Brave New World, there's a different reaction to that at the end of that book. That's more about that's more about your libertarian free market capitalist sort of environment. And at the end of that, there's kind of the main character in it is looking to escape from this environment and is allowed to get outside of the environment and exist in sort of more primitive sort of way of being. He's sick of the city environment. So you can kind of make those up. Either you submit to the system or you try to escape from it. And what happens a lot with some psychiatric treatments, if they fail, say if somebody isn't responding to treatment, sometimes somebody ends up on a psychiatric ward for years, you know, drugged up to the eyeballs, and ends up in like a drooling mess in the corner of a psychiatric ward. I've seen this with my own eyes. The people they almost end up in the system for most of their lives, and they abandon reality. But then, when the psychiatric treatments succeed, the person takes their place in a humdrum office and may never again become imbalanced. And Carl Robinson talks about, it is not for us to measure the spiritual cost of this compromise, but sometimes when reading case histories of psychiatric cures, you have an oppressive sense that the doctor has been the devil's advocate. So that adjustment to a sick society isn't a good adjustment either. That's what sort of Carl Robinson is getting at there. So you kind of think, how do I deal with all this sort of stuff going on? And the first thing to do is use reason. So on a personal level, just use your reason, use your capacity, your intellectual capacities to try to figure some of this stuff out. We have that there. We have an ability at different levels. People have different levels of reasoning skills. Of course, children, say below the age of 7, can't reason, or can't reason sufficiently to hold them responsible. And then other people that maybe have sort of learning difficulties as well, don't have that sort of same ability to reason. But most people do have an ability to reason. So reason, try to use reason. But one thing that's really important with reason is that you don't let your passions dominate your life. So that's coming back to controlling your body and controlling those emotions, controlling the urges, and prioritizing the soul. And using reason. And as Father Rippinger says here, if the passions dominate, reason becomes eclipsed by judgment being affected. One becomes intellectually blind. So make sure that you're in control of your passions and that you're reasoning. So that's the sort of first step, just reason things out. That's a personal thing you can do. And also understand science. Like, I mean, I'm a big lover of science. Like, I mean, it's incredible to investigate things and try to figure out the how and why of the world. And it's like being I think, like, if you lose that sort of that enthusiasm for how and why things work, then you're probably not, you shouldn't be in the scientific field anymore. You have to keep that sort of childish, almost, I want to figure things out. Without it being, there's a difference between there's a thirst for truth, and there's a greed for knowledge, and there's that sort of making that distinction. Sometimes it's good to have that thirst for truth, but it's not good to have a greed for knowledge, because that can lead to curiosity and lead you off into all sorts of weird and wonderful, weird and really dangerous directions. So that, as Professor Dupre says, he's a professor of philosophy in the early 20th century in Harvard, a really good Catholic apologist. He talks about man not only wants to see things, not only wants to see things and events, but he's anxious to know their how and why, two words which are frequently used by both the child and the adult. And also just talk about how, Father Doolin talks about how if you want to sort of understand man, or want to understand what man should do, you have to understand what man is. So if you don't understand what human beings are, you can't really understand what they should do. So that comes back to understanding that they're both a body, human beings have a body and a soul. And also Louis Pasteur, who people might have heard of, he's behind pasteurizing. That's what he sort of invented. So he's still very relevant today. He talked about how the more deeply he investigated the mysteries of nature, the simpler became his fate. And that's kind of similar, I suppose that's a similar experience for myself. From looking into things, from just investigating things from a scientific point of view, you actually end up, your faith becomes a lot simpler, becomes a lot clearer, because you see that the science matches up with the faith. They're not in conflict. They're completely, science supports the faith rather than refutes it, as some scientists like to believe. This is really important as well. Sometimes we don't get a clear idea of what Christianity is. It can be very much distorted. We get a really distorted picture of it rather than the sort of an accurate representation of it. That's why it takes a lot of it's about studying it and sort of trying to understand what the Christian theory of theory actually is. And from my own experience, like I can't say that I really understood Christianity when I was young, or that I understood Catholicism, but only from taking a step back and sort of reading more, looking at the philosophy, looking at the psychology, looking at the theology, I've come to understand it more. So it really needs to be presented well, otherwise you could rebel against it and see all the incoherency in it. So Father Edward Lean talks about how the Christian theory of life is so coherent, so logical, so simple, yet so mysterious, so accommodates the average man as well as the most highly gifted, and finally so soul-satisfying that when adequately presented, it must readily recommend itself to all men of sincerity and goodwill. It's incredible. It's the Christian, you kind of get the pure Christian truth, pure Catholic, pure Catholicism. It's amazing how it sort of resonates with your soul. So that's what he's kind of talking about there. So what's the next step? Like, I mean, once you've used reason, once you've used logic, once you've looked at the evidence, and once you've studied the sciences and they've been presented clearly to you, what's next? Like that will bring you so far, but it won't give you a full sort of understanding about things. Okay, so that's when the next step. I don't want to talk. This is one area. This is kind of verging into theology, so it's not an area I'm particularly familiar with. I'm more familiar with the psychological side of things, but I'll talk about it briefly just to sort of give an understanding of it. And it just talks about how the ascent to the truth requires humility, grace, and the supernatural virtue of faith. This is where theologians, the minds of theologians, people that can explain these things well, it's just incredible, because they're very complex things to understand what exactly the virtue of faith is and how do we come to believe what we believe. But he's just saying that humility is essential to, and grace as well. It's a gift from God as well. So, and also it's a virtue, a supernatural virtue that the faith is. So I'll just have one quote on this, which captures some of what I mean by faith. So this is from Father Edward Lean. He wrote an excellent book again called Why the Cross. Again, a book probably 30s or 40s, which just sometimes when you read these sort of books, you just think they capture things just so eloquently and precisely. So he talks about how to see God perfectly, and in consequence to possess him perfectly does not belong to the condition of the life on earth. God is enveloped in the thick veils of faith, but imperfect though the vision of faith be, yet it is vision. By it God is beheld and possessed in a manner which is a beginning of the final vision and the final perfect possession. The vision of faith proper to the time of exile can go on constantly, increasing in perfection. The more perfect it becomes, the more happiness it imparts. So it is a virtue, faith, and it can be prayed for, of course, as well. So it's pray for the virtue of faith, hope, and charity, particularly, but also its grace as well. It's the grace of God is what kind of helps people to ascend to these beliefs and to accept the truth. There needs to, and also with all this psychological jargon out there's what tends to happen is different models or examples are thrown out to people like this is the model to follow or this is the model to follow, and it kind of people can get very confused by this because you need a role model to follow. You need some sort of example to follow. And Bishop Fulton Sheen says this very, very well. He talks about how psychoanalysis, based on materialist philosophy, so that's philosophy that just talks about, doesn't mention the soul, can offer no norm, no ideal, no motivation, no dynamism, no purpose in life. It has none of these things to give. Yet an ideal there must be. Each personality cannot be his own model. Otherwise, who of us is crazy and who is sane? So there needs to be a model, and this is what Fathers Farrell and Healy sort of talk about here. And Christ is the model in that. He's the model to inspire us and aspire to. You need that model. You need a focus, and that's what kind of keeps society together when people are focused on that. So Fathers Farrell and Healy talk about the perfection of the human nature of Christ is an inspiration to all men. It shows them what God wants them to be. Not that all men or any one man could ever reach the excellence of Christ, of course, because Christ was God, the God-man. But it is the will of God that all should approach the perfections of Christ as closely as possible. Like the saints stories sort of give us that example of how these saints approach the example of Christ. So you still got the problem, even if people could agree that Christ is the model to follow, and that would solve a majority of problems in our society. It wouldn't solve everything because we're not living in heaven, so there would still be problems, but it would solve a lot of our problems. You still got who says what's the authority that says who is right and wrong still? You still need some sort of authority to direct people, because we're prone to subjective bias and error. We're always going to we always get things we might always get things slightly wrong. And so is there an objective source to guide us, and who defines what is true? And also that's a really contentious one. Who decides what Christ meant or what God meant? And that's caused a lot of problems in our society, because we've got one group saying this is what this passage of the Bible means and this is what this passage of the Bible means. So who sorts that out? Otherwise you're going to go around in circles all the time if you don't have an authority to sort this out. So that's the Catholic Church. That's what the Catholic Church was established to do, to sort out these issues and say, this is what's meant here, this is what's meant here, this is the dogma now. That means it's more true than 2 + 2 = 4. You can accept the dogma as that, but actually, it's beyond falsification. It's set in stone. So Father Doolin talks about how the Catholic Church has always upheld St. Thomas in his insistence that the business of science as well as philosophy is to ascertain not what people think, but what is the objective truth or fact. So the thing is, the church tells people you should believe this because it's true. It doesn't say we should believe it just because I say it's, that's just it. It says this is true, so you should believe it. So that's what the church is trying to do. It's trying to get to things that are actually true and objective and say, look, this will guide you to heaven. And also, as a result of following this as well, your society will be much, much better as well. This life will be much better. And that's where dogmas are needed as well. There's a brilliant book called Rebuilding the Lost State by John L. Stubbard. He's excellent. He's a Anglican convert. His book about his conversion is amazing. But he talks about how clear, unequivocal statements of conclusions mutually arrived at and accepted are essential to any body of believers. People know that even if you're working in a job, like you need certain values or beliefs to sort of keep the organization together, and they all follow that so people can sort of get on with the job. And there's certain things that are just accepted. But that's the same in, it's particularly important. It's the same in theology, and it's the same with faith. And it's even more important. So talk about such clear and unequivocal statements are its dogmas, and are as necessary to the church as bones are to the human frame to hold its flesh together. There's a lot of people attacking the dogmas of the church, and these are things that are written in stone. These are guaranteed by the Holy Ghost. And there's a lot of people saying, like, I don't want to accept that one, I don't want to accept that one, but they're there to be ascended to. It just means you have to, and that takes grace, and that takes the virtue of faith as well to accept these dogmas as well. But they're the bones to they're the vital part of the church. And if they're destroyed or they're sort of picked at, then the whole church, the whole edifice collapses around it. So, and just people might object and say, well, the church. What about the church? The church didn't treat the. What about the mentally ill? People might think, oh, they didn't treat them that well, or things like that, and might do talk about that sort of thing. But this Carl Robinson again points out that most references to medieval treatments of the insane in textbooks are wildly inaccurate. Talks about how snake pits were a device of the ancients. The chained inmates of Bedlam were a post-Reformation scandal. So there was after the breakaway, a lot of the stuff that was the scandals that happened in mental health institutes were after the Protestants broke away from the church. And a lot of these scandals happened in those countries. And diabolism as an all-pervasive explanation was 17th century. True history does honour to the church. Medieval references to the care of the insane were simple and salutary. Above all, what honours the church is that mental disease never became a major problem while the world still lived within the framework which she made. So just something, if the church is doing well, society does well. If you're recognizing the truths of human beings, then mental health problems don't become as prevalent. There will be still people that have certain psychological issues, but they won't be anywhere near as bad as they are today. If you live in a Catholic state. Also, the enemies of the church admit that the church wasn't involved in mental health abuses. There's been loads of things like lobotomies and all sorts of horrible practices in psychiatric hospitals, but these weren't the church. The church wasn't involved in that. The church didn't get involved in those cases. So a lot of that stuff is coming from secular psychiatric theories rather than Catholic theories. So finally, this is where the conclusion is. This is from the conclusion over the four talks. This is kind of summing up everything. So I put the result of error. Father Rippinger has written a really good book called Introduction to Science and Mental Health, and this just puts it straightforward. It says no psychological theory which condones sin can ever be one that contributes to the mental health of individuals or society. Modern psychology is condoning sin. Most modern psychologists are just saying sin is absolutely fine, and it's actually a sort of guideline of the psychological societies today to affirm sinful behaviour. But as Father Rippinger says here, no psychological theory which condones condone sin can ever be one that contributes to the mental health of individuals and society. What about the need for truth? This comes back to what I talked about. You need a clear picture of Christianity, and it needs to sort of try to lift people up as well, to say you can be better than you currently are. And then particularly for the youth as well, it's really important. So if the radicalism of the adolescent is not matched by the depth and breadth of his faith, if he experiences religion and morality as narrowness and imposition, then his faith is threatened. And Christian morality must not appear to the young as oppression, but as fulfillment of a better self. So it doesn't say, look, you can lift yourself up. You don't need to be like the Kardashians. You don't need to be like the people you see on Big Brother. You can be somebody. Lift yourself up, and you can be like a saint. And that can be a sort of the most humble person can be a saint, as Our Lady sort of shows, and a lot of the saints show as well. Or you could be, an incredibly talented artist or writer like Michelangelo or Shakespeare, and be Catholic. So you need to lift people up. And also, this is the final piece. It's just talking about. This comes back to what I talked about the dogmas and the need for the whole truth to be kept intact as well. So, this is the need for the faith and its protection. Christ's theory of life is one. If a single element of it be subtracted, the whole crumbles to pieces. So if the dogmas particularly, or the doctrines of the church are attacked and they're sort of dismissed, then the whole edifice starts crumbling. And we've seen that. It's been on that sort of slide for the last 500 years. So that's. I've got one last quote. I've thrown loads of quotes at you, but I've got one last quote from. So this is just talking about how important the truth is and how important it is to combat error. Right? So Pope Saint Felix III says, "Not to oppose error is to approve it, and not to defend the truth is to suppress it." So that's it. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about over these 4 talks about the theories of modern psychology. And I'll just give there's a few books there that I've mentioned already. There's a couple of religious books. The Imitation of Christ is brilliant. The Introduction to Devout Life is excellent. I don't want to get into the theological aspects of it. The catechetical instructions of St. Thomas Aquinas are brilliant. It's just really simple, straightforward, really easy to understand. Then there's a couple of a conversion story, rebuilding the lost faith. Also, if you want to understand the relationship between the church and science, the Catholic Encyclopedia is really good. And that book, Mirage and Truth by Father M.C. Darcy, he was called, I think he was called by Henry Sire. Henry Sire is a historian, a Catholic historian who's alive today. He wrote a book about Father M.C. Darcy and called him the philosopher of Christian love. His books are for anybody that's kind of a reader and likes good, really beautifully sort of worded language. I suppose he's a really good writer. Iota Unum, if people want to understand what's been happening in the church over the last 60 years and some of the sort of why things are so bad within the church today, Iota Unum's an excellent one. And again, My Life with Thomas Aquinas is a brilliant read as well. So.